The screen mounted above the office window read 1,065 pounds. It was showing the last steer of the load, which was standard on the Ashford livestock deck, and the number would clear in a moment and give way to the running total. Ada Combs had loaded that trailer herself. She had chained the gate herself. She had weighed each of those 9 head twice in her own barn, 2 mornings before standing on a wooden platform her grandfather had leveled with a folding rule in a jar of shims in 1969. And she knew standing there on the wet concrete of the Ashford livestock scale yard, with her cattle tag punch swinging on a leather loop at her hip, that nearly 2,000 pounds of her beef had disappeared somewhere between her gravel lot and this pretty electronic deck. Certified, that was what the young man behind the glass said when she asked. Certified twice a year, sealed by the state, stickers right there on the post. Then an old man got down on one knee at the edge of the platform and shone a flashlight into the dark gap beneath. His name was Elias Kessler, 78 years old, stocky through the chest, that slight forward stoop of a man who has spent 6 decades looking at the ground for a living. Thin white hair combed straight back over a bald crown, black-framed reading glasses shoved up on his forehead where they lived. Deep laugh lines fanning out from pale blue eyes that were not doing any laughing. I didn't say anything for a good 10 seconds. Just breathed through his nose and moved the flashlight beam back and forth the way a man reads small print. Ada stood over him with the ticket in her hand. 10,905 pounds. 9 head of black baldy steers backgrounded on her own grass for 11 months. And the paper in her fist said the whole load came in roughly 1,800 pounds lighter than what she had measured across her grandfather's barn scale 2 days before. She turned the ticket over once. Her jaw was set square, cold air already pinking her cheekbones and the tip of her nose. The loose, low ponytail of medium brown hair with its faint chestnut warmth pulled back from her forehead, wispy strands escaping around her temples the way they always did by the middle of the morning. She wore the same worn red and cream plaid flannel button-up she'd worn to the funeral, layered under a weathered tan canvas farm jacket, with the darker brown hood softened by years of somebody else's work before it had ever been hers. Faded medium blue denim jeans dusty at the thighs and knees from feeding out that morning at 4. She was 24 years old, small-boned, wiry, strong, and she had not raised her voice once. Not when the digital readout stopped on that last steer. Not when the young man behind the glass had said sealed and certified. Not now. Dale Fales came around the alley with his hands on his hips, shifting weight foot to foot the way he always did. 29, broad and soft through the middle, reddish-brown hair under a stiff feed store cap pulled low. Royal blue polo tucked crooked under a station jacket, black two-way radio bouncing on his belt. Shoulders, rounded chest, a little sunken, the kind of man who had never once in his life had to hold still. Stickers right there, he said, and pointed at the yellow certification decal on the post. State inspected in March. That's 7 months. Machine don't lie, honey. Like a sticker ever pushed a steer up a ramp. Then came Preston Whitfield. And here's where a man ought to hold on to something. Charcoal wool jacket, pale blue shirt open at the collar, no tie. Oxblood loafers picking their way across a lot floor that had never once in its history been kind to nice shoes. Silver rectangular glasses, a stainless steel clipboard tucked under one arm, the tally sheet clamped flat, one hand in his trouser pocket, like the whole yard was a room he was renting out to lesser people. 41 years old, regional livestock station manager, the kind of man who signs his name with a fountain pen and knows the exact angle to lift his chin for a photograph. He looked at the ticket in Ada's hand. He looked at her boots. He looked at her face. And he smiled. Patient. Practiced. I'll take it as printed, Miss Combs. He said her name the way a man reads a diagnosis off a chart. The scale doesn't have opinions. You do. And I understand. First sale after a death in the family. Emotions run high. The numbers never match what a person's got in their head. That's normal. That's grief. That's not fraud. He paused. Let it sit. But you've been farming what, less than a year? Your grandfather's arithmetic was a hobby. Ours is a business. Sign the ticket. Take the check. Go home. Don't embarrass yourself in front of buyers who actually know what they're doing. He said it the way a man flicks lint off a sleeve. Ada looked at him for a long moment, weight on her back heel. Her hands went into the jacket pockets. The flat brass cattle tag punch on the leather loop at her belt swung once and went still. "I'll need a receipt," she said. "Wait in, wait out. And the name of whoever certified that deck." Preston Whitfield's smile thinned about a millimeter. "That's not how we do things, Miss Combs." "Then those are my terms." She turned and walked back up the alley. "You want to know what a closed door sounds like that?" She reloaded all 9 head herself. Dale watched from the fence and didn't offer. Preston watched from the office window with his clipboard, and somewhere in his skull, he was already filing her under stubborn, ignorant temporary. Ada worked the gate, backed the trailer, and got every steer up the ramp in 11 minutes. Every hand on that lot found something else to look at. And here is what none of them bothered to know about her. Amos Combs had been dead 11 months. Her grandfather, 81 years old, dropped in the loafing shed at first frost with a feed bucket still in his hand and his old wool coat still buttoned. The vet who came for him said it was the heart. The undertaker who came for him said he had died the way farmers die, which is with the work half done. He had left behind 240 acres of thin Kentucky pasture on a limestone ridge outside Halloway County, 31 head of mixed cattle, a barn with a good roof and bad doors, a stone farmhouse the color of wet ash, and 40 years of leather-bound journals stacked on the kitchen table like they were waiting on somebody. Nobody else in that family wanted a dime of it. Her uncle in Louisville called the place a rock pile with a mortgage. Her mother in Ohio called it a mistake. There was a cousin in Cincinnati who called it on the phone at the wake in the kitchen with the coffee still going cold in the pot. That old man's problem, finally. Ada was 24, flat-shouldered, wiry from throwing square bales since she was old enough to lift one, fair skin with a warm undertone that had gone sun-marked across the bridge of her nose, a soft oval face with a slight taper toward the chin, large light blue-gray eyes that people who did not know her mistook for gentleness. She had gone to community college for 1 semester of animal science and come home when Amos got tired. She moved into the farmhouse the week after the funeral with 2 cardboard boxes and a coffee pot. She was the only one who wanted it. The journals she read at night at the kitchen table under a hanging bulb, in order the way you'd read letters from someone still writing them. Rainfall by month, breeding dates, hay yields per acre going back to 1946, cull weights, coyote sightings, the name of every dog that had ever worked that place, and how each one had died. Amos wrote in a cramped, hard-pressed pencil hand that leaned to the right, and he had never in his life wasted a word. And in the 3rd book, on a page dated April of 1961, next to a small sketch of a beam scale with the poise weight drawn in, she found a sentence he had underlined twice. "A number is only as honest as the ground it stands on." She read it 4 times. She read it out loud once in an empty kitchen at 10 past midnight with the wood stove clicking as it cooled. She thought at first that he was writing about honesty. She thought he meant the way a man's word depends on the man, the way a promise depends on what a promise costs. It took her a while to understand. He wasn't writing about honesty at all. He was writing about the ground. Literally, the actual dirt. It just took her a while. Now here is the thing you have to understand about Amos Combs's barn. Bolted to the joist at the north end of the alley, under 40 years of hay chaff and dust, and the ghosts of 2,000 feed cats, sat a mechanical beam scale. Not a scale like most folks picture. Not a bathroom scale. Not a butcher's scale. This was a platform 8 feet by 3, sitting on a nest of cast iron levers underneath the barn floorboards, and the whole load rode on hardened steel knife edges. Thin wedges of hardened steel honed sharp, resting and bearing cups. That's the trick of the thing. A knife edge has almost no friction. It doesn't slide. It doesn't drag. It rocks. The weight of a steer comes down on the platform, transfers through a compound lever system that divides the load by a fixed ratio, travels up a steel connecting rod to the beam head, where you slide a counterpoise, a small brass weight along a notch bar until the pointer floats dead level between two stops. No electricity, no display, no calibration certificate from a company in a strip mall in Frankfurt. Just physics and a sharp piece of steel. Compare that to what Ashford Livestock ran. A load cell deck, a slab of concrete 60 feet long, weighing thousands of pounds itself, sitting on 4 steel canisters, each canister holding a strain gauge. A strain gauge is a thin foil resistor bonded to a block of steel. Load bends the steel. The foil stretches. The electrical resistance changes. A box converts the resistance to a number. The number prints. Beautiful system, accurate as hell, when it's calibrated. When the pit under the deck is dry. When nobody in a royal blue polo shirt with an embroidered station logo has leaned on the trim potentiometer inside the head unit with a jeweler's screwdriver on a slow Tuesday afternoon. Ada drove home from Ashford Livestock that day with 9 unsold steers rattling behind her and the heater blowing cold for the first 3 miles because she had forgotten to turn it on. She did not turn on the radio. 21 miles of 2-lane blacktop past cornfields, harvested and gone brown, past a country church with white paint peeling in strips, past a mailbox with the name Kessler burned into a plank of cedar. She unloaded in the dark, forked out hay, checked water, walked the fence line with a flashlight until her hands stopped shaking, went inside with her hands still smelling like wet rope. Then she set the ticket down on her grandfather's kitchen table right beside the stack of leather journals and sat down with a pencil. 9 head. That's what she had in the trailer. That's what she wrote at the top of the page in pencil on the back of a feed receipt at the kitchen table with the ticket lying there like a dead bird. 9 head, average weight by her own eye, and her grandfather's records somewhere in the neighborhood of 1,400 pounds apiece. Market that week at 61 cents a pound. That's $854 a steer, $7,686 for the whole string. The ticket in front of her said something different. It always did. Ada Combs sat there until the coffee went cold, that single loose ponytail hanging over her shoulder strands, loose at the temples, the way they always got by evening. The freckles across the bridge of her nose looked darker in the low light. She did not cry about it. She did arithmetic about it, which is a whole lot more dangerous than crying about it. And any man who has ever done arithmetic at a kitchen table in the middle of the night about money that did not add up already knows exactly what I mean. Then she went out to the barn. She stood in front of her grandfather's mechanical beam scale with the flashlight in her hand. And she thought about the underlined sentence. A number is only as honest as the ground it stands on. She had thought it meant honesty. It didn't. Ada spent the next 2 days cleaning that scale. She swept 40 years of hay chaff off the platform. She pulled the deck boards up one at a time and looked into the pit under her own barn floor. Dry. Bone dry. Her grandfather had built the pit with a 2% slope to a French drain in 1969 and had inspected it every spring of his life. There were pencil dates on the underside of the boards in his cramped slant one for every year. The last one said April of the year he died. She scraped the knife edges with a strip of soft brass shim stock, slow working, careful, because a knife edge is a piece of hardened steel, honed to about 6/1000ths of an inch, and a fingernail scratch in the wrong direction will take a scale out of tolerance for the rest of its life. She checked the bearing cups for pitting. She hung her grandfather's certified test weights on the platform, 50 pounds each, 6 of them. 300 pounds, even the same weights he had used to check his scale every spring for 4 decades. She adjusted the balance ball. She watched the beam pointer float between the stops. She waited for it to settle. It settled dead level at 300 pounds. She smiled for the first time in 3 days. Then she ran the cattle through one at a time and wrote it down. Steer 1, 1,410 pounds. Steer 2, 1,398 pounds. Steer 3, 1,422 pounds. She weighed each animal twice, once at dawn off water, once at dusk after they'd been in the paddock all day. She logged the shrink between the two weights and wrote the temperature in the margin. Twice because the journal said twice. She had found the entry the first night. Amos's handwriting, 1971. Small and slanted, the leather cover soft as a glove where his thumbs had worn it. Weighed the black steer myself at 110. Sold him at 940. Weighed him again in my head all the way home. And below it in a different pencil, added later like a man muttering to himself, a number you didn't produce yourself is somebody else's opinion. Weigh it twice. Once for the market, once for the truth. That's the whole religion right there. Weigh it twice. She stood in her barn at 10:30 at night with a spiral notebook and a pencil and 31 head of cattle running through her grandfather's beam scale, one at a time, and she wrote down every single number in pencil in her own hand. Dated temperature, noted time noted. By the end of the second day, she had a page of numbers. And by the end of the second day, she also had the shape of the thing. Because here is the thing about a scale. A good scale is boring. A good scale gives you the same number twice. A good scale gives you a number that matches what your eye already knew. A steer that stands eye to eye with a 5-foot rail and carries flesh clean over the ribs and pin bones is not a 900-pound steer. He is a 1,400-pound steer. A man who has been looking at cattle for 40 years can call a steer within 30 pounds off a fence, and a man who has been looking at cattle for 60 years, like Amos, can call one within 15. Ada had grown up looking at cattle. She knew what these steers weighed. She had known it standing on the Ashford scale watching the last steer's number stop and the running total build before she had ever done a single sum on a feed receipt. She just hadn't yet been able to prove it. Word got around a county fast, and it got to the feed store in Kettle Springs by Thursday. Hollis Bowen ran that store. 62 years old, wire-rimmed glasses on a chain around his neck, a green apron tied twice around a narrow waist, because Hollis had shrunk 2 inches since his wife had died 4 winters back. He kept a jar of hard candy on the counter and a shotgun under it, and both had been there since 1971. Ada bought her mineral tubs and her rock salt and her spool of nylon twine from Hollis because Amos had bought his from Hollis's father and because Hollis was one of the few men in that county who had never talked to her like she was borrowed. But Hollis was not the one who told her. Elias Kessler was. Elias came in on Thursday morning in his brown duck overalls and the same black frame reading glasses shoved up on his forehead. He stood the way he always stood, hands clasped behind his back, rocking a little on his heels, the scratched steel folding rule sticking out of his chest pocket like a badge of office. He didn't waste words. "They're having fun with it," he said, down at the counter. "Fun with what?" "Amos's granddaughter weighing cows in her barn like it's 1940. He rocked. "Somebody said you ought to bring a horse and buggy next time, save gas." Ada stood there in the olive plaid flannel under the tan canvas jacket, hands hooked in the pockets weight on her back heel. She looked at the shelf of mineral blocks for a second. The pink came up hard across her cheekbones the way it did in November. It always did. It was one of the things she had inherited from her grandfather. The Combs blush, Amos had called it. Any man in that family could hide anger for exactly as long as it took his blood to come up in his face. Then she picked up a fresh spiral notebook. 69 cents. Set it on the counter. That was it. That was her whole rebuttal. A notebook. You have probably had a moment in your life, some quiet moment sitting in a diner or a boardroom or on the tailgate of a truck, where the smart play was to say nothing and let the work argue for you, and everybody in the room mistook your quiet for you having nothing to say. Ada let them think it. Cheaper that way. Elias watched her put the notebook in her jacket pocket. He watched her pay. He watched her walk out. He waited a beat. Then he followed her out to the parking lot and stopped her at the tailgate of her truck. And this is what he said. "Your granddad did the same thing once." She turned, bought a notebook, started counting. He was rocking on his heels, hands behind his back, reading glasses catching the sun. October of 1968. He looked at her for a long moment, pale blue eyes gone soft, the way old men's eyes go soft when they are remembering a friend. You'll want to hear about that one sometime. When you need to. That was the whole conversation. She drove home. She started counting. The single steer she hauled to Ashford Livestock the following Monday was the biggest one in her string, a black baldy she had named quietly, and only to herself, number 14, because he had come off the trailer as number 14 out of Amos's last calving book, and because Amos had circled his ear tag number in ink and written good one next to it in the margin. She had weighed him twice on her grandfather's beam scale that morning. Once at dawn off water, once again 40 minutes later after he had stood in the alley chewing his cud. 1,440 pounds, both times. She hauled him alone. She backed the trailer up to the ramp at Ashford at 9:45. Cold morning, steam coming off the concrete where the sun hit. The whole lot smelled of manure and diesel and wet gravel, and there were 3 trailers ahead of her in line, and none of the men in those trailers looked at her when she got out. Dale Fales was working the scale house that morning, broad and soft through the middle reddish-brown hair curling under the stiff feed store cap, the black two-way radio bouncing on his belt. He looked at the single steer in her trailer, and his mouth did something unpleasant. "One head," he said, and laughed through his nose. "Honey, we've got a minimum here for a reason." "He'll fit." "Sure he will." He leaned on the rail, radio swinging. "You know your granddaddy used to do this too." Ada did not look at him. "Show up with 2-3 head. Argue every ticket. Old man never did figure out that the scale don't care about his feelings." He tapped the steel deck with his boot. "It's electronic. It's certified. You want to fight a computer, that's your business." He shifted his weight, foot to foot, that childish rock. "But folks like you always think the world's rigged because that's easier than admitting you can't run a farm." He said folks like you the way a man flicks ash off a sleeve. Ada did not answer. She backed the trailer to the ramp. She got number 14 up onto the deck. She stood with her hands in her jacket pockets while the load cells settled and the printer inside the scale house chattered, and she watched Dale Fales lean back in his chair and pick something out of his teeth with the corner of a business card. The ticket came out. Dale slid it across the counter without looking at her. 1,235 pounds. She stared at it. She had weighed that steer 3 times in her own barn. 1,440 pounds. Twice at dawn. Once at dusk. The beam floating dead level between the stops. 205 pounds gone. Somewhere between her barn floor and this pretty concrete slab, 205 pounds of beef had simply stopped existing. Ada Combs took the paper. She read it once. She said nothing at all. She got number 14 back onto the trailer. She drove home. Back at the kitchen table that night, she opened the 1971 journal to the page about the black steer. She folded 2 tickets, folded once, and pressed them flat into the back of the leather cover, right where the leather had gone soft from 40 years of thumbs. Then she smoothed them out on the kitchen table under the hanging bulb and did the arithmetic in pencil in the margin, because that is how Amos would have done it. The steer she hauled alone weighed 1,440 pounds on her farm scale. Ashford Livestock printed him at 1,235. That is 205 pounds gone somewhere between her gravel lot and their concrete deck. 14.2%. The load of 9 from the week before came in at 12,730 pounds farm weight, 10,905 on the ticket. 14.3%. She sat there with a pencil in her fingers, and the pink came up along her jaw and across her cheekbones the way it did when her blood came up. Because here is the thing about theft, real theft, the professional kind. It is not sloppy. A broken scale wanders. A broken scale gives you +4 one day and -1 the next, and it averages out to noise, and any man who's ever worked with test equipment in his life knows that the signature of a genuinely broken instrument is randomness. Errors are random. That is the whole definition of the word. What she had in front of her was 13 to 15% every single time, in one direction only. That is not a wandering scale. That is a rate. Errors are random. This wasn't random. This was a rate. She called the state weights and measures office at 8 the next morning and got a woman with a pleasant telephone voice who put her on hold for 19 minutes without apology or explanation. The line clicked twice. A man came on. He introduced himself with a last name Ada did not catch, and he spoke to her in the tone a man uses for a slow child, and he told her that the Ashford Livestock Deck Scale was certified, sealed, inspected on schedule, last certification March of that year, tolerance verified with test weights, paperwork on file in triplicate. Ada asked what happens if a certified scale drifts out of tolerance between inspections. The man said, "That's what the seal is for." Ada asked if the seal weighs the cattle. Long pause. The man suggested she take it up with the facility. That is the machine right there. Not a villain in a black hat. A man in an office who has a procedure, and the procedure says the scale is fine, and therefore the scale is fine. And your steers evaporating 200 pounds apiece is your problem. Preston Whitfield called her that afternoon. She let it ring 4 times. He was warm. God, he was warm. He said he had reviewed her file personally, and he wanted her to know that Ashford Livestock took producer concerns seriously, especially from smaller operations. Especially from, and here he did the little pause folks who were new to running things on their own. She said nothing. He said the yard would be pleased to extend a goodwill adjustment. $180. Not an admission of anything, of course. Just a gesture, a courtesy. There would be a short release to sign. Standard language, waiving further claim on the 2 loads in question. Then he added the part he couldn't help himself on. "Miss Combs, I'll be candid with you. Your grandfather kept his books on paper napkins, and it caught up with him. Nobody's blaming you for not understanding the equipment. But there comes a point where a person has to accept that this business has moved past the kitchen table way of doing things and either learn the difference or stop wasting everyone's afternoon." He said it kindly. That is what made it filth. Kindly. Ada looked down at the 2 tickets on the table and at the 1971 journal open next to them and at her grandfather's handwriting in pencil on the inside cover of the 3rd book, where he had written his own name in 1957, the day he bought the leather-bound blank ledger from the stationery store in Bardstown for $2 and change. She said one thing: "Send me the March inspection report." 9 words. She hung up before he answered. Then she sat in the empty kitchen for a long time, with her hands flat on the table on either side of the 2 tickets, and the pink went out of her cheekbones slowly, the way it always did, and the wood stove clicked as it cooled. And outside a coyote gave one long yip out, past the north fence, and the killdeer answered from the creek bottom the way they always did at dusk in that country in November. She was 24 years old. She was $180 away from making the whole thing go quiet. And she was not going to take it. Not because she was brave, because she had done the math. 180 was not a goodwill adjustment. 180 was a receipt for the fact that Preston Whitfield already knew what his scale was doing. Elias Kessler came by that evening because Elias Kessler always came by on Thursdays. 78 years old, hands behind his back, rocking slightly on his heels in her doorway, with the steel folding rule sticking up out of his chest pocket, like a small flag of intent. The porch light caught the smudged lenses of his black frame reading glasses, which were as always pushed up on his forehead. He walked into the kitchen without being asked. Amos had always walked into that kitchen without being asked, and Elias had been walking into that kitchen for 40 years, and the arrangement was so old that the linoleum by the door had a worn spot in the shape of a boot from the 2 of them. He sat down in Amos's chair. Nobody had told him he could. Nobody needed to. Ada put the 2 tickets in front of him. He pushed the black-framed reading glasses down off his forehead and held the paper at arm's length in the way of a man whose eyes had gone soft on clothes work sometime around 1974. He read them twice. He turned them over. He read them again. And then he pushed the glasses back up on his forehead and went very quiet. Ada waited. Then Elias Kessler said a name. Talmadge. She frowned. The old Talmadge yard, up past the county line, been closed since '81. He tapped the ticket once with a thick finger. October of 1968. Your grandfather hauled 11 head there and came home with money for 9. Ada did not move. He didn't holler. He didn't call the paper. He didn't write the state. Elias was rocking on his heels even in the chair, which is the sort of thing only a very old man can do. He borrowed my truck and a bathroom scale. He looked at her sideways over the tops of the reading glasses. He weighed sacks of corn, 40 of them, 40-pound sacks, and he drove them across the Talmadge deck one at a time on a flatbed, and he made the yard print a ticket every single pass. How did it end? Yard boss wrote him a check for $460. Elias's laugh lines went deep for a moment. Then they smoothed out again. And the yard boss got moved to a job in Louisville a month later. Was anybody arrested? Nobody was ever even called a cheat out loud. He pulled the folding rule out of his chest pocket, snapped one section open, snapped it shut. Habit. Wasn't necessary. Ada looked down at the 2 tickets. She looked at the 1971 journal open to the page about the black steer. She looked at the underlined sentence 4 books later on a page dated 1961. A number is only as honest as the ground it stands on. She had thought it meant honesty. She had spent 11 months thinking it meant honesty. And she looked at Elias Kessler across her grandfather's kitchen table, and she understood in one clean moment the way understanding sometimes comes when a man is not looking for it, that her grandfather had not been writing about honesty at all. He had been writing about a pit. She said, Elias. I know. The ground. I know. He set the folding rule down on the table between them. You want to go have a look at the ground at Ashford Livestock? She did not answer right away. She got up. She poured him a cup of coffee. She poured herself one. She sat back down. She said, tell me about the pit. Elias Kessler picked up the folding rule again, laid it flat on the kitchen table, and began to draw with the tip of it on the wood grain of Amos's table, the way a man draws in the dust with a stick because there was no paper handy, and he did not need paper for this. A truck scale, he said, is not a scale the way a bathroom scale is. He tapped the table. What you drive onto is a steel and concrete deck, 60, 70 feet long, and it does not sit on the ground. What does it sit on? Load cells. He held up a thick finger. 4 of them at Ashford, squat steel cylinders, bolted to concrete piers, 1 at each corner. And each cell is a strain gauge, which is a piece of foil bonded to a block of steel, and when weight comes down on the block, the foil stretches, the resistance changes, and the head unit reads out a number. And the deck floats. He looked at her hard. That is the whole trick of the thing. The deck touches nothing but the 4 cells. Nothing. Not the ground. Not the ground. Not the walls. Not the pit floor. Nothing. Ada leaned forward. And if the deck touches something else? Elias Kessler smiled for the first time all evening. It was not a happy smile. Then that something else carries part of the load. He tapped the table. And the cells never see it. He tapped again. And what the cells never see. Tap. The ticket never prints. He set the folding rule down. The wood stove clicked in the corner. The killdeer had gone quiet. A soft wind pushed at the north side of the farmhouse, and somewhere out past the barn, a heifer bawled once and stopped. It doesn't take much, Elias said. Silt washes in, pit don't drain, mud packs up under one corner. Rust swells a bearing plate until it binds. A check rod bends a finger's width off, true the kind of thing you'd never see unless you were down in the muck looking for it, which is exactly why nobody ever has. Bind one corner on a 4-cell deck and you'll pull 13–14% off every load that crosses it. He looked at her, steady as a clock. And the seal on the side of the cabinet won't say one word about it. He tapped the folding rule against the table. The seal only certifies the electronics. Ada sat back in her chair. She looked at the two tickets folded flat on the kitchen table under the hanging bulb. She looked at the 1971 journal. She looked at the underlined sentence 4 books later. She looked at her grandfather's chair at Elias, sitting in it, at the folding rule laid crosswise on the wood grain, like a small silver bridge between one story and another. A number is only as honest as the ground it stands on. Not the number, the ground. She stood up. She walked to the door. She lifted her tan canvas jacket off the peg. She pulled it on. She turned back around and looked at the 78-year-old man drinking her coffee in her grandfather's chair. Elias. Yeah. Meet me at the fence line at dawn. He drained the cup. He put it down. He nodded once. He did not smile. But he pushed the reading glasses down off his forehead and held them up to the light and rubbed a smudge off one lens with the corner of his shirt. And he said the last thing anyone said in that kitchen that night, and he said it soft the way a man says the amen at the end of a long grace. Well then, let's go have a look in that pit ourselves. Outside, the wind came around the north side of the barn and pushed a scatter of dry oak leaves across the gravel toward the porch. The killdeer down at the creek did not answer. Somewhere farther out, a coyote gave the long yip and cut off short. The temperature was going to drop below freezing before morning, and the ground was going to be hard, and the mud was going to be locked into whatever shape it had settled into by that afternoon. And Ada Combs stood in the doorway of her grandfather's farmhouse, with her hand on the frame, and she looked out into the dark toward the ridge road that ran east toward the Ashford livestock scale yard. And she thought about a lot of things. She thought about the pit. She thought about the check rod. She thought about a young man in a royal blue polo shirt with a station logo embroidered over his heart, tapping the steel deck with his boot and saying, "Machine don't lie, honey." She thought about a 41-year-old man in oxblood loafers with silver rectangular glasses saying, "Sign the ticket, take the check, go home." She thought about her grandfather at 24 years old hauling 11 head to the Talmadge yard and coming home with money for 9, and about how 40 years later he had still been writing about that pit in pencil in a leather journal at his own kitchen table, and how he had underlined the word ground twice, and how he had known. He had known for 40 years, and he had waited until his granddaughter was old enough to hold a flashlight. She stepped out onto the porch. She pulled the door shut behind her. She stood there in the cold with her hand still on the doorknob and her breath coming out white, and she said one thing quietly to nobody at all, or to her grandfather, or to the pit itself, and it did not matter which. She said, "Weigh it twice." Then she went to bed. She was going to need her rest. The ground was going to argue back. Dawn came in the color of skim milk over the ridge east of Ashford livestock, and it came cold. The gravel apron in front of the scale house had frozen overnight into a hard rime crust that crunched under boots. Ada Combs stood at the fence line with her hands hooked in the pockets of the tan canvas jacket breath, coming out white, the low ponytail of medium brown hair tucked down inside the darker hood. The pink was already up along the tops of her cheekbones from the cold. 24 years old, 20 degrees Fahrenheit, and the yard had not opened for the day. Elias Kessler pulled up beside her at 6:40 on the dot in the same dented Chevy pickup he had driven since 1978. He got out slower than he wanted to. Brown duck overalls buttoned to the throat. Watch cap pulled down over the thin white hair. The reading glasses were already pushed up on his forehead where they lived, and the folding rule was already sticking up out of his chest pocket, and he had brought a flat pry bar from his own truck bed and a heavy rubber flashlight with fresh batteries. He did not say good morning. He said, "You bring the camera." She patted her jacket. Loaded. 12 frames, 24. He nodded once. He did not smile. He looked past her at the low gray building with the office window and the yellow certification sticker on the post. He looked at the scale deck itself, 60 feet of concrete and steel bolted flat to the earth, and he looked at the seam of the pit hatch on the east side of the apron. He said, "Yard don't open until 7:30. That's why we're here now. You know they'll call the sheriff. They'll call somebody." Elias adjusted the folding rule in his pocket. He looked at Ada for a long moment. pale blue eyes gone soft the way they went soft when he was thinking about Amos, then hardening back up again. You ready to get filthy? I fed 31 head this morning. I'm already filthy. He walked. She followed. The pit hatch sat flush with the concrete apron on the east side of the truck deck. A steel plate, maybe 2 feet square, rusted at the seams, half buried under a crust of dried manure that had been driven over so many times it had gone hard as fired clay. Elias got down on one knee beside it, 78 years old, that slight forward stoop. One thick hand braced on his thigh, and the other working the flat bar into the seam of the plate. The hinge screamed. Not loud, but loud enough for a still cold morning with the sun not yet up. Dale Fales came around the corner of the office trailer at a jog. Royal blue polo. Feed store cap pulled low. That black two-way radio bouncing on his hip. Sir, sir, you need to get up off there. Elias did not get up. He reached back without looking, took the flashlight Ada handed him, and shone it down into the dark. Water. Standing water. Maybe 4 inches of it, black and skinned with an oil sheen, floating a raft of straw and cigarette filters, and a crushed soda can that had been down there long enough to lose its label. The smell that came up out of that pit was old wet rust and manure gone sour and something colder underneath. Something mineral. Something like a well that has not been drawn from in a long time. Elias did not flinch. He held the beam steady. This is a pit, he said, more to himself than to anyone, that is supposed to be dry. He shifted the beam. This is a pit that is supposed to be swept. He looked up at Dale. When did this get cleaned last? Dale shifted foot to foot. That's maintenance. That's not me. One useless answer delivered with total confidence. Ada crouched at the far edge of the opening, olive plaid flannel showing at the collar of the canvas jacket, the single loose ponytail falling forward over one shoulder until she pushed it back. She did not say a word. She held out her hand. Elias gave her the flashlight so he could take the folding rule out of his chest pocket. Here is what a truck scale actually is, and it is simpler than the industry wants you to believe. That giant steel and concrete deck the trucks drive onto, it does not touch the ground, not anywhere. It floats on 4 load cells. Squat steel cylinders bolted to concrete piers, one under each corner. Each cell a strain gauge that turns downward pressure into a small electrical signal. 4 numbers get added. That sum is your weight. Around them run the check rods. Loom steel arms bolted horizontally to keep the deck from wandering sideways when a loaded semi comes on at 8 miles an hour. The check rods steady the deck. They are not supposed to hold it up. Not 1 pound of load is supposed to travel through a check rod. Elias walked her through all of it on his knees at the edge of the pit, the flashlight beam moving from pier to pier, while Dale Fales stood over them, repeating that they were not authorized, that this was equipment, that somebody was going to get hurt. Anything, Elias said, and he said it quietly, the way an old man says a thing he has said before and does not enjoy saying again. And I mean anything under that deck besides them 4 cells takes a share of the load. The beam moved. Whatever the junk carries, the cells never see. The beam moved again. And what the cells never see, the beam stopped. South corner, packed up against the underside of the deck and mounded over the concrete pier like a swallow's nest, was a wedge of compacted manure, wet straw, and pea gravel, layered, pressed, repressed by 10,000 truck passes until it had the density of poured mortar. It was not sitting near the steel. It was jammed against it. Load-bearing, a solid column of filth doing the job of a structural post. Elias slid the folding rule in along the seam. He had to work it. It went in 3 inches and stopped against something that did not move. There it is, he said. His voice was almost soft. And behind it, the south check rod, bent. Not dramatically. Bowed maybe a finger's width off, true. The kind of thing you would never see unless you were down in the muck looking for it, which was exactly why nobody ever had. A bent check rod put side pressure on the deck. Side pressure plus a mound of packed manure jammed under the corner, and that deck is not floating anymore. It is leaning, it is resting, it is handing a piece of every single load to the dirt instead of the sensor. Every truck, every ticket, every farmer in Halloway County. Ada took the camera out of her jacket. "Ma'am, you cannot photograph." Dale said it louder now. "Volume in place of evidence. Certification's current. State came out. It's got a sticker. It's got a sticker right on the head unit. I seen it." Elias looked up at him from the ground with those pale blue eyes. "Sticker says they hung test weights on a clean deck on a dry day, son." He held Dale's gaze until Dale looked away. "When was this pit last swept out?" Dale opened his mouth, closed it, keyed the radio instead. Nobody at Ashford Livestock could answer that question. Not the kid, not the shift lead, not the maintenance contract sitting in a filing cabinet in a metal desk in an office trailer 20 feet away. Not one person in that entire operation could produce 2 years, 5 years ever. Preston Whitfield came across the apron about 90 seconds later, and he was not hurrying. Charcoal wool jacket, pale blue shirt, no tie. Oxblood loafers picking their way around the wet spots with the delicacy of a man who has never once in his life bought his own boots. Silver rectangular glasses. One hand in his trouser pocket, the clipboard under the other arm. He looked at Elias Kessler on his knees in the manure and he smiled. "Mr. Kessler." Warm. "Should you be on the ground at your age?" He let it hang. Someone gets confused. They wander onto industrial property. They start poking at machinery they don't understand. That's how families end up making difficult decisions. Then to Ada, gentler, worse. "Sweetheart, I know it's hard when the numbers don't come out the way you hoped. But you're a girl with a hayfield and a grudge. And this is a certified state instrument." He shifted the clipboard. "Take the old man home. You're both trespassing on private property. Leave now and I won't make it anything more than that." He said it warmly. That is the part that ought to turn a man's stomach. He was never angry. He was patient. The way you are patient with something small. Elias got up off his knee. Slow. On his own. He put the folding rule back in his chest pocket. He turned his back on Preston Whitfield. Ada did not answer. She turned back to the hatch, braced her elbows on the concrete, pressed the shutter once. Twice, the advance lever ratcheted in the cold with a small mechanical sound that carried further in the still air than it should have. She shot the standing water, the 4 piers, the bowed check rod. Then she leaned in close and photographed the 3 inches of packed manure and pea gravel wedged solid under the deck's south-bearing plate boot toe, visible at the edge of the frame for scale. 12 frames. She stood up. She capped the lens. She looked at Preston Whitfield. She did not say a single word to him. She and Elias walked back to their trucks. Dale stood behind them with the radio in his hand, not knowing whether to key it. Preston Whitfield stood in his oxblood loafers on the frozen apron with his one hand in his trouser pocket, and he watched them go and his chin stayed lifted the whole time because a man like Preston Whitfield does not lower his chin for anybody. Not for a 78-year-old with dirt on his knees, and not for a 24-year-old woman with a camera in her hand. Ada drove home. She dropped the film at the drugstore in Bardstown the next morning. $4 in change. They came back in an envelope on Thursday. She laid the whole strip out on her grandfather's kitchen table under the bare bulb, edge to edge. 12 photographs like cards she already knew were good. The south-bearing plate of the Ashford livestock deck scale with 3 inches of packed manure and gravel wedged under it. The load cell housing half buried. A close shot of her boot toe beside it for scale. The scuffed brown leather giving the eye something to measure against. She had shot 2 frames of the ticket printer window and one of the date stamp on the office door. She got a spiral notebook and started building the thing properly. Page 1. Her own barn scale log. Every head weighed at home the morning of shipping. Every temperature. Every hour. Written in pencil in her own hand. Dated. Page 2. The 2 Ashford livestock tickets taped down flat. The number circled. Page 3. The arithmetic, 9 head plus 1, an average of 200 pounds of daylight between what her scale said and what theirs did on every head. At the going rate that October, that came to $1,600 and change on the 2 loads alone, on one small farm, in 3 weeks. A small noise under a steel deck. Catastrophic failure across an entire county's paychecks. She drove out to Elias Kessler's place with the notebook on the seat beside her, and she found him standing in his driveway with his hands behind his back, rocking slightly on his heels, the way he did the folding rule, sticking up out of his chest pocket like a badge of office. He read the pages twice with his black frame glasses pulled down off his forehead. Then he pushed them back up and said one thing: "I'll write it out and sign it." He did. He did, in block capitals on a sheet of lined paper. That he had hauled cattle to Ashford Livestock for 31 years. That he had watched the pad get built up and never scraped. That debris under a bearing plate takes weight off the load cells and puts it nowhere at all. He dated it. He signed his full name: Elias H. Kessler. He pressed hard enough to dent the sheet. Ada mailed the whole file certified to the Division of Weights and Measures in Frankfurt on a Tuesday and paid the extra 60 cents for the green return card. She got the card back 4 days later with a scrolled signature on it that meant somebody in Frankfurt had put her manila envelope down on a desk and then walked away from it. The reply came 19 days after that. 1 page, state letterhead, 3 paragraphs of polite nothing, and then the sentence that did the work. Petitions for out-of-cycle retest of a certified commercial scale may be submitted only by the scale's owner of record or by a licensed buying agent operating on that device. Read that again. The only people allowed to question the scale are the people who profit from it. Ada stood in the driveway with the letter and the cold coming up off the gravel, and the pink came up hard across her cheekbones the way it did in November. She did not say a word. She folded the letter. She put it in the file. She went inside and set the file on the table beside the 2 tickets and the 12 photographs and Elias's signed statement. She stood at the table for a long time. She did not sit down. Preston Whitfield's letter arrived the following Friday. And that one was not polite. It was worse. It was pleasant. Ashford Livestock, it said, would not be in a position to receive Combs cattle at this time. Nothing personal, of course. And then the part he could not resist. Typed clean, one hand no doubt still in his trouser pocket while he dictated it. We have found that producers of your scale and experience often benefit from a season of learning before returning to a certified facility. There is no shame in being over your head, Miss Combs. Most people your age are. He signed it with a fountain pen. 41 years old. Silver rectangular glasses. Oxblood loafers that had never once stood in a wet lot. Telling a woman who had been weighing cattle since she was tall enough to see the beam that she was over her head. That was the night the rain came. It started around 8 in the evening and settled in on the tin roof of the farmhouse like it planned to stay. Steady, even. The kind of November rain in Kentucky that softens the ground for winter and turns the ridge road to mud 2 ruts deep between the mailbox and the cattle guard. Ada sat at her grandfather's kitchen table with the hanging bulb over her and the bills fanned out in front of her. Feed store, $290. Vet, $140. The county tax notice on the 240 acres. And under all of it, in an envelope she had been not opening for 11 weeks, a standing offer from a development outfit out of Louisville. $480,000. $2,000 an acre for ground her grandfather had bought at $90 an acre in 1954, with money he had earned pouring concrete for the Corps of Engineers. She looked at the envelope for a long time. She got a clean sheet of paper out of the drawer. She uncapped the pen. She wrote, "To whom it may concern." She wrote, "I am prepared to discuss." Then the pen stopped. She stared at those 5 words. Rain on the tin, wood stove clicking in the corner. A single 60-watt bulb over a kitchen table where 4 generations of Combs men had done arithmetic. Where Amos had underlined ground twice in a leather journal in 1961. Where he had left, without ever saying so out loud, a plan for his granddaughter to find 26 years later. Ada put the pen down. She got up. She put her canvas jacket on. She walked out through the rain to the barn. Inside it was warm in the way a full barn is warm. Breath and hay and the low grind of cud. The heifers did not spook when she came in. She stood in the alley and looked at them a long time. Coats slick and tight. No dull spots. No rough hair standing at the shoulder. The water in the stock tank was clear enough to see the bottom seam. The mineral tub had gone down 2 inches since Sunday. Number 14 stood at the far end of the alley chewing his cud and looking at her with the mild, curious eye of a well-fed animal that had never in his life been hungry. She ran a hand down his flank. She felt the fat cover over the rib. She felt the muscle in the hip and the depth of the barrel and the flat, slick hair of an animal that was in every conceivable sense of the word. Right, and she knew in her palm and not her head, that this steer weighed 1,440 pounds. Not 1,235, not 205 pounds gone, 1,440. She stood there with her hand on his shoulder for a long time. Then she walked back to the house in the rain, and she took the offer letter and the sheet of paper on which she had written, "I am prepared to discuss," and she tore both of them in half. She opened the door of the wood stove. She dropped both halves in. The flame came up around them yellow and fast and went to blue at the edges and then to nothing at all. She closed the door of the stove. She got a second spiral notebook out of the drawer and wrote across the top of the first page in her own hand in pencil tickets. Others. Then she ruled 4 columns: name, date, head, reported weight. 1 farm's numbers were an argument. 20 farms' numbers were a pattern. And patterns are the one thing a clipboard cannot smile away. She had exactly 0 of them so far. She underlined the columns anyway. 2 days later, she stood at the feed store counter in Kettle Springs with her hands hooked in the pockets of that faded olive plaid flannel under the tan canvas jacket, waiting for Hollis Bowen to finish counting out mineral blocks. Green apron, wire-rimmed glasses on the chain. When Hollis looked up, she said the thing she had been chewing on all night. "You keep your Ashford tickets." That was it. No speech, no pitch. Just a question from a 24-year-old woman with a low ponytail down her back and cold pink burning across her cheekbones. And Hollis Bowen laughed the way men laugh when they do not know what else to do with their face. Then he stopped laughing. He looked at her over the wire-rimmed glasses. He looked at his shoes, and he said, "I'll bring you what I got." That was Wednesday. By Friday, 3 men had left plain manila envelopes on the passenger seat of her truck without saying who they were. You have probably had a moment like this in your life, sitting alone at a kitchen table under a bare bulb after some quiet decision you did not tell anybody about. You were fighting for something small, something almost too small to argue over. 9 head, 3 weeks, a rounding error. 2,000 pounds of your cattle vanishing into a scales rounding error. And the state told you that you did not have standing because a form was filed under the wrong subsection. 9 head is a complaint. 4,000 head a year is a crime. Ada had done that arithmetic sitting at the kitchen table with the rain on the roof, and she had put the pencil down, and she had understood finally what her grandfather had known for 40 years. That scale did not only weigh Combs' cattle, it weighed everything that rolled through those gates. Every steer, every cull cow, every load of feeders from every farm in 3 counties going back years. If the deck was tilted, it was tilted under all of them. Every single load, every single week. And not one of those men had ever thought to compare his own barn scale to the ticket in his glove box. Why would he? You trust the scale. That is the whole point of a scale. So she asked. Feed store, church lot, the diner on 62. Men who had chuckled at her over coffee for 8 months. Men who had said things like, "She ought to let a man handle the hauling, and she'll learn they all learn." Those same men went out to their trucks, pulled ticket books out from under crumpled napkins and receipt piles, handed them over without a word. The question had landed somewhere uncomfortable, and they wanted to know too. Nobody apologized. Nobody ever does. They just showed up with paper. Wendell Dinkins showed up on a Monday morning. 69 years old. Tall the way Kentucky men used to be tall. 6'2" at the shoulder, even stooped hands the size of catcher's mitts, and knotted up at the knuckles from a life of pulling calves in cold weather. Bald crown, a fringe of white hair around the back. Gray coveralls faded almost to the color of concrete. A rolled-up handkerchief permanently in his hip pocket the way some men carry a pocket knife. He drove a 1974 Ford F-100, the color of dried blood, and he pulled up to Ada's gate at 10 past 9 with a shoebox on the passenger seat. The shoebox was rubber banded. Twice. He carried it up onto the porch and set it on the porch rail and did not knock. Ada came out. Wendell Dinkins did not waste words. Amos had told her that once. That man Amos had written in 1976 in the margin of a hay contract has said maybe 11 sentences to me in 22 years, and every one of them was worth writing down. Wendell looked at her. He said 6 years. He tapped the top of the shoebox with one gnarled finger. Every ticket, and I wrote my barn weight on the back of each one. Same day, same hour. He looked at her a long moment. You still want it? Ada took the box in both hands. She said, yes, sir. He nodded once. He got back in the Ford. He drove off. She stood on the porch with the shoebox in her hands, and she felt the weight of it, and she understood in that moment that she was not holding 6 years of tickets. She was holding the last hard proof that a very old man who did not talk much had been quietly keeping his own books for 6 straight years in his own hand on the back of somebody else's paper because he had known. He had not known what he knew, but he had known enough to write it down. She carried the box inside. She set it on the kitchen table. She sat down. She untied the rubber bands and lifted the lid. Elias Kessler came at noon. Ada had called him from the co-op phone the night before. They worked at the kitchen table until the windows went black. 6 years of Ashford livestock tickets. Paired ticket for ticket with Wendell Dinkins's own barn weights, written on the back in the same slow, careful hand. Wendell was the kind of man who wrote things down twice. He weighed off water in the morning, wrote the number down, weighed again after feeding, wrote the second number down, averaged the two. And then when Ashford printed a ticket, he wrote his own average on the back of theirs in pencil, so he could look at both numbers side by side over supper. Elias pushed the reading glasses down off his forehead. He held 2 tickets side by side and moved his lips a little the way he did when he was doing arithmetic without a pencil. He said, Ada, I see it. Look at 79. She saw it. The drift started in 1979, small at first, 2%, 3. By 1983, it was running double digits, and it never once ran the other direction. That is the tell. Random error goes both ways. A scale that is genuinely broken cheats everybody, including the man who owns it. This one only ever leaned one direction, and it leaned harder every year, like something being nudged a little further each time nobody screamed. Elias taught her the table. 4 columns ruled out in pencil on a piece of butcher paper taped to the wall next to the wood stove. Farm weight, ticket weight, legitimate shrink allowance, residual difference. That third column, Elias said, rocking on his heels with his hands behind his back and the folding rule sticking up out of his chest pocket, is where they will fight you. So we give it to them first. Give it all away. And they did. They gave it all away. Standard hauling shrink on a 2-hour run is 3 to 4%. Cattle lose water. They lose gut fill. They stress and they sweat. Feed and water off overnight adds another point or two. Elias reached into his overall pocket and pulled out a folded extension bulletin from 1984 and read the number aloud. 6%. He looked at her over the reading glasses. That's the outside number. Any honest man in Kentucky would call 5, but we'll take the outside number so nobody can say we shorted them. Ada subtracted 6% from every single line, every load. Even the 20-minute hauls where 6% was flat-out charity. The gap held. 12, 14, 15 on the heavy loads. Have you ever watched a number refuse to move no matter how hard you try to explain it away? That is what that butcher paper looked like at 2 in the morning. Column after column of penciled subtraction and the residual just sitting there, stubborn as a stone in a boot. Then she did the arithmetic nobody had done. She took her grandfather's records for what Ashford livestock ran in an average year and multiplied by a decade. 4,100 head a year. Call the average carcass ready weight 1,000 pounds. Fat cattle were bringing 61 cents a pound that season. Shave 13% off a 1,000-pound steer, and you have taken 130 pounds. That is $79 and change out of one animal. Times 4,100 head. $325,000 a year. Out of the pockets of men who were arguing about the price of a mineral tub. Now run it back to 1979. Ada set the pencil down. She did not pick it up again for a full minute. Elias took the reading glasses off. He cleaned the lenses on his shirt. He put them back on. Neither of them said the number out loud. 8 figures across a decade. Quietly siphoned off a 2-lane road in a county where a bad year means selling the tractor. And Preston Whitfield, who had stood in her drive with his stainless clipboard and his oxblood loafers, and had told her in that patient, pitying, chin-lifted way, "Miss Combs, I understand, this is a lot of money to someone in your position, but the equipment is certified, and you are not qualified to read it." Someone in your position. He had said it like a diagnosis. Turns out her position was directly on top of every ticket he had ever printed. She sat at the kitchen table until 3 in the morning, going over the drift year by year, and Elias fell asleep in Amos's chair with his reading glasses pushed up on his forehead and his hands folded on his belt. She did not wake him. She let the fire burn down. She sat with the arithmetic. There was still one problem. The state had said no. Petitions for out-of-cycle retest of a certified commercial scale may be submitted only by the scale's owner of record or by a licensed buying agent operating on that device. A producer could not compel a retest. Ada was a producer. Wendell Dinkins was a producer. Every single man who had walked out of a feed store back room and pushed a rubber-banded shoebox across a truck seat to her without saying who he was. Every one of them was a producer, and not one of them could file for a retest of that scale because the state of Kentucky had either by accident or by design written the rule so that only people who profited from the scale had standing to question it. That rule was the whole thing. That rule was why nobody had ever looked in the pit. That rule was Preston Whitfield's fortress. But there was another category. A licensed cattle buyer with a dealer number has statutory standing to challenge any scale he buys across. Bonded buyer, dealer number, statutory standing. And there is not a technicality in the book that closes that door. Ada wrote a name at the top of a fresh page. Cyrus Beecham. Cyrus Beecham had bought cattle out of Ashford livestock for 19 years. 19 years across that deck. 19 years of tickets. 19 years of paying farmers for beef that was not there. Ada drove out to his place on a Wednesday afternoon. It was a hard drive. 22 miles up into the hills toward the West Virginia line. 2-lane blacktop cut through hollows so deep the sun did not reach the road until noon. She passed the shell of the old Talmadge yard closed since 1981, where her grandfather had once weighed 40 sacks of corn onto a flatbed to prove a thing without ever having to say the word cheat out loud. The gateposts of the Talmadge yard were still standing. The scale house was down to its concrete foundation. She kept driving. She pulled into Cyrus Beecham's place at 3:15. Cyrus Beecham was 58 years old, tall, lean gray at the temples. Deep vertical lines cut in each cheek from a lifetime of standing outside in a wind that never quite stopped. He wore a barn coat the color of wet oak leaves. He wore boots that had been resoled twice. He was standing at the tailgate of a 2-ton truck when she pulled up, and he had one hand flat on the tailgate and one hand in his pocket, and he watched her come up his drive the way a man watches a hawk over a chicken lot. Ada got out with a notebook on the seat beside her and the butcher paper table rolled up under her arm. Cyrus Beecham said, "You Amos Combs's granddaughter." "Yes, sir." "Then this is about the scale." She stopped. She said, "How did you know that?" Cyrus Beecham did not answer right away. He looked past her down the drive toward the mailbox and the road toward the direction of Ashford Livestock, 26 miles south by the 2-lane. Then he looked back at her. He said, "I have been buying out of that yard for 19 years, Miss Combs." He said it very slowly. "And it has been 14 or 15 years since I have been able to look my own numbers in the face." Ada laid the butcher paper table on the hood of his two-ton truck and stood there in the wind while he read it. He did not say a word for 6 minutes. He read the 4 columns twice. He ran a finger down the residual column line by line. He turned the paper over to look at the back where Elias had written out the multi-year multiplication in block capitals. He asked one question. "This shrink column." He tapped it. "That's the friendly number. That's the friendliest number in Kentucky." Cyrus Beecham looked at her. He looked at the paper. He looked back at her. He said one thing. "Miss Combs." "Yes, sir." "Nobody has ever asked me to." That was the answer. That was the whole answer. 19 years across that deck. 19 years of a dealer number that gave him statutory standing to challenge any scale in the state of Kentucky. And in 19 years, not one producer had ever come up his drive with butcher paper under her arm and asked him to sign for them. He signed. He signed not because he was brave. He signed because he could, and nobody had ever asked him to. The certified letter went out on a Thursday. Return receipt requested. 15 signatures at the bottom. Cyrus Beecham's dealer number first. Then 14 producers who had handed over their glove box paper without being begged. Wendell Dinkins, Hollis Bowen, Elias Kessler, 11 others. Ada Combs's name last in her own hand in pencil because the pen had run dry at the kitchen table at 11 at night, and she had not wanted to get up for another one. That night she laid all 14 sets of tickets out on the kitchen table under the bulb. Every last one of them light against the farm weight. Every last one of them leaning the same damn way. She sat there a long time. The rain had stopped 4 days back. The barn was full. The stove was low and warm. The killdeer had gone quiet for the season. Somewhere out past the north fence, a heifer bawled once and stopped, and Ada Combs, 24 years old, sat at her grandfather's kitchen table in the light of a single 60-watt bulb with 14 sets of somebody else's paper spread in front of her and one long ponytail hanging over her shoulder and the pink long gone out of her cheekbones because the anger had gone somewhere colder now. She looked at the underlined sentence in the 1961 journal. "A number is only as honest as the ground it stands on." She said it out loud. She said it the way a man says amen. Then she closed the journal. She put her hand flat on the leather cover. She said quietly to nobody, or to her grandfather, or to whatever it is that listens in a farm kitchen at midnight, when a young woman has finally understood what she has been left, "They're going to have to come look." Outside, a very cold wind came around the north side of the barn and pushed a scatter of dry oak leaves across the gravel. It was Thursday. The certified envelope was already in a canvas bag in a mail truck rolling north toward Frankfort. Somewhere in Frankfort, a woman with a pleasant telephone voice was going home for the weekend without knowing that on Monday morning, a certified envelope was going to arrive on somebody's desk with 15 signatures on it, and a dealer number at the top, and a photograph on the third page of 3 inches of packed manure and pea gravel wedged solid under a bearing plate of a certified state scale. Preston Whitfield did not know either. I was at a dinner in Louisville that night. Charcoal wool jacket, silver rectangular glasses, one hand in his trouser pocket, the other holding a small glass of something clear. He was telling a story about a stubborn woman up in Halloway County, and the men at the table were laughing, and he was not aware, was not remotely aware, that at that exact moment in a farmhouse kitchen, 61 miles south, a 24-year-old woman was closing a leather journal and putting her hand flat on the cover and saying, "They're going to have to come look." I did not know. He would. The white truck came in at 7:40 on a Thursday morning, hauling a flatbed trailer stacked with certified test weights. Steel blocks, each one 1,000 pounds, painted state gray with a stamped seal on the top face. 2 men from the Division of Weights and Measures. A forklift chained to the back of the trailer. A clipboard that was not Preston Whitfield's. Ada Combs stood at the fence line by the gravel apron with her hands hooked in the pockets of the tan canvas jacket. The loose, low ponytail of medium brown hair pulled back tight against the cold. The darker hood pushed off her shoulders, even though the wind was up. The pink was already high in her cheekbones. 24 years old. December of the year Amos would have turned 82 if he had lived. And she did not go any closer. She had handed over the paperwork 3 weeks earlier. 15 signatures, 14 producers, Cyrus Beecham's dealer number at the top of the page, 6 years of Wendell Dinkins's shoebox tickets, Elias Kessler's block capital statement, 12 photographs of a pit that had not been swept in longer than any man on that lot could remember. She had said 11 words at that state office. She was not going to add any this morning. She was going to stand at the fence. She was going to watch. Here is the thing about how they test a livestock deck, and it matters more than anything anyone said out loud that day. A platform scale that size does not sit on one sensor. It sits on multiple load points, corners, edges, a grid of them. And every one of those points has to read true because a steer does not stand politely in the middle of a scale deck. He walks on at the south end. He mills. He leans against the rail. He shifts his weight onto 3 feet and then 4. So the state does not just pile a stack of test weights in the center of a deck and call it good. They do section testing. They set 1,000 pounds on the northeast corner. Read it. Move it to the northwest. Read it. Southeast, southwest, center. Then they combine. They double. They run it up to 8,000 pounds and back down, checking the return to 0 every single time. And that is exactly what nobody had done at Ashford Livestock in 11 years. Because here is the beautiful, filthy little detail. The annual certification, the paper Preston Whitfield waved around like a christening gown, was done by a contractor who loaded the center only, rolled the blocks to the middle of the deck, stacked them, read the number, signed off, went to lunch. Center is where the binding does not bite. Center is where the lever arms hang free and honest. The whole deck could be crippled at the south corner, and that test would come back clean as a whistle every single year for a decade. 11 straight years of a passing grade on a scale that had been quietly shaving cattle. They started at 9, forklift beeping, blocks coming down slow off the trailer, the operator calling numbers, and the second man writing on the clipboard. Northeast, good. The block moved. Northwest, good. The block moved. Center, good. The block moved to the southeast corner. A pause. The operator waited. The reader watched the digital head unit. He wrote a number down. Southeast, good. The block moved. Then the block went down on the southwest corner, and the man reading the head went quiet for a second and said the number twice and wrote it down. And then he had the forklift lift the block and set it back down, and then he said the number again to be sure it was light, not a rounding error. Light. He looked over the top of the clipboard. He said one word. Again. The block came up. The block came down. Light. Same number. Same corner. He turned to the other man. Get the sheet from March. Ada did not move from the fence line. By 10:15, they had opened the pit. You want to know what the state photographed under that deck? A scale pit that had never been pumped. Standing water gone black. 8 inches of packed manure hair grit and hoof-scrape bedding wedged solid up into the lever framework at the south end. Packed so tight it had gone dense as clay. And the check rod. The steel bar whose entire job is to keep the platform floating free and centered. Bowed. Jammed against a bracket. Bent. Binding. A scale like that does not lie randomly. A scale like that lies in one direction, always toward the house. They photographed all of it. Ruler and frame. Timestamps. Preston Whitfield came out of the office at some point in there. Charcoal wool jacket, pale blue shirt, no tie. Oxblood loafers picking their way across gravel he clearly resented. Silver rectangular glasses. Chin up. Stainless clipboard under one arm out of pure habit because there was nothing on it that anybody wanted anymore. He was calm. He was always calm. That was the whole act. "There is a maintenance contract on this," he said, pleasant as a hotel clerk. "We have had turnover in the yard staff. Frankly, this is an oversight at the operational level, and it is unfortunate. But I would caution anyone against reading intent into a mechanical issue." Then he glanced across the apron at Ada, and he let it get personal because he could not help himself, especially somebody who could not read a scale ticket 8 months ago. He said it lightly, like a joke among professionals. Nobody laughed. The inspector did not even look up from his form. That was the last insult Preston Whitfield ever landed on Ada Combs. And it landed on nothing, because Dale Fales was standing 11 feet away in his royal blue polo, with the station logo cap on radio, on his hip shifting his weight foot to foot, the way he did, freckled forearms crossed. And Dale Fales had been holding something in his chest for 4 years. The inspector asked him plain, "When was this pit last pumped?" Dale did not look at Preston Whitfield when he answered. He looked at his boots. He said, "Not since I started." 6 words. The inspector wrote it down. "When did you start?" "May of '86. The man wrote it down. Preston Whitfield's chin did not lower. Not yet. Dale reached into the inside pocket of the station jacket. He pulled out a folded piece of paper. Yellow carbon copy. Faded. The corners rounded from 4 years in a drawer. He held it out to the inspector without looking at Preston Whitfield. "That there is a maintenance request I filled out on the pit." His voice was flat. "June of '86. Second week I worked here." He tapped the paper. "Standing water. Debris under the south corner. Recommended pumping." The inspector took the paper. He read it. "Who signed off on this request?" Dale did not answer. He did not have to. The signature line was blank. But the routing box at the bottom of the form had 2 initials in it, pressed hard in blue ballpoint, and the initials were PW, and the little date stamp next to them said June 19 of the year. Dale Fales had started, and there was a second stamp in red across the whole face of the form. The kind of stamp a manager keeps in a top desk drawer, and the red stamp said one word: denied. The inspector looked at the paper for a long moment. He folded it once. He put it in his own clipboard. He looked at Preston Whitfield. He did not say anything. He did not need to. You want to know what a man looks like when the ground goes out from under him, and he is still holding a stainless steel clipboard. He looks like a man who has decided to walk back to his office trailer because there is nothing else in the world to do. Preston Whitfield did not run. Men like Preston Whitfield never run. He turned his back on the fence line and the pit, and the 2 state inspectors, and the freckled 29-year-old who had just put 4 years of quiet knowledge on a clipboard, and he walked back across the apron with his one hand still in his trouser pocket and the other still holding the stainless steel tally sheet. His chin stayed up, but his shoulders had come down 1/4 of an inch. And any man who has ever watched another man walk away from something he cannot come back from knows exactly what 1/4 of an inch means. At 1:40 that afternoon, they cut the lead security seal off the head unit, the little soft gray slug on twisted wire that is supposed to prove nobody has been inside since certification. Clipped it, bagged it, tagged it, photographed it against the clipboard. Then they hung the red tag. Red tagged means the scale is out of service. Out of service means the station cannot legally weigh a commercial transaction, cannot buy a single head of cattle, not one, not until the pit is cleaned, the check rod replaced, the levers freed, the whole deck rebuilt and section tested and recertified with a new seal and a new number. Preston Whitfield stood there with his hand in his trouser pocket, chin still lifted, running a business that as of 1:40 in the afternoon on the 16th of December could not conduct business. Ada watched them wire the tag. Then she turned around and walked to her truck with that slow, deliberate stride weight on the back heel, brass cattle tag punch swinging on the leather loop at her belt. No fist in the air, no word to anybody. She did not look at Dale. She did not look at Preston Whitfield. She did not look at the scale. She got in the truck. She drove the 11 miles home. She backed up to the barn. She cut twine on 4 bales. She forked out. She checked water. She ran her hand down number 14's flank one more time and felt the flat, slick hair of an animal that was eating right. Elias Kessler's voice sitting in her head the way it always did. You don't argue with a man. You just outlast his arithmetic. The report came 8 days later. 3 pages, state letterhead. The deck read 13.4% light at the south corner. Seal broken. Scale decertified. Ada laid the 3 pages on the kitchen table under the bulb next to Amos's 1961 journal. She did not smile. She did not cry. She just put her hand flat on the report the way a man lays a hand flat on a Bible in a courthouse, and she left it there for maybe 5 seconds. Then she got up. She went out and fed. The red tag went up on a gray Tuesday. Red card stock wired through the eyelet on the scale house door, state seal in the corner. One word in block letters that everybody in 3 counties learned to read by heart. Decertified. Dale Fales stood beside it in his royal blue polo with the station logo stitched over the heart. Hands on his hips, shifting his weight foot to foot the way he always did when the ground got soft under him. His two-way radio did not make a sound all morning. Nobody had anything to say to him. Here is the part people do not expect. The state did not just yank the certificate and go home. The Division of Weights and Measures opened a claim window, 90 days, and they posted it in the Halloway County paper, the Nelson County paper, the LaRue County paper, and on the cork board of every feed store within 40 miles. Any producer who had crossed that deck in the previous 40 months could file. But you had to bring paper, your own numbers written down before the ticket in your own hand. You understand what that meant. Every man who had hauled to that scale on faith, who had taken the printed ticket as gospel and thrown his own notebook in the truck door pocket unread. Every one of those men got nothing. Not because the state was cruel, because there was nothing to compare. You cannot prove a theft if you never counted what you had. Ada had counted every load, every head, every last variance. 4 years of it in Amos's format, ink dated, weather noted in the margin feed change, noted in a second column temperature at weighing on the top line of every page. She walked into the hearing room in the olive plaid flannel under the tan canvas jacket with the cattle tag punch swinging on the leather loop at her belt and the loose, low ponytail down her back. And she set 11 notebooks on the table, and she did not make a speech. She did not make a speech at all. She opened Notebook 1, 1984, Amos's hand. She turned the page. She said, "That is my grandfather's." She opened Notebook 2. She said, "This one is mine." Then she sat down. The state examiner did the arithmetic. The total when the 90 days closed was $412,000 split across 31 producers. The largest single claim was Ada Combs's. Then came the strangest month of her life. They came back one at a time, not in a group. Men like that do not travel in groups when they are eating something. Rufus Talley came first. Rufus Talley was 73 years old, thick through the neck, cheeks gone soft, a broken nose from a bull that had caught him in a chute in 1971. Rufus Talley had been the loudest man at the coffee counter at the feed store in Kettle Springs for 11 months. He had said things like, "She's playing farmer with a dead man's toys, and she ought to marry somebody and be done with it." He drove up to her gate on a Thursday in January in a Ford truck older than she was. He got out. He held his cap in both hands. He did not walk up the drive. He stood at the gate. Ada came out. Rufus Talley cleared his throat twice before he spoke. He said, "Ma'am." He said, "How'd you know?" He said, "How'd you know to write down the gut fill before you loaded?" That was the whole apology. That was the whole thing. He did not use the word sorry. He did not use the word wrong. He said, "How'd you know to write down the gut fill?" which is not an apology in any dictionary, but which is exactly what an old Kentucky farmer means when he is standing at your gate with his cap in his hands. Ada looked at him for a moment. Then she opened the gate. She said, "You weigh them off water in the morning. Same hour, same order. And you write the hour down too, because the hour is half the number." Rufus Talley nodded slow. She said, "Come inside, I'll show you the format." He came inside. She showed him the format at the kitchen table under the bulb. She showed him the 4 columns. She showed him how her grandfather had written the temperature in the top margin and the feed change in the second column and the shrink notation on the right side of the page. Rufus Talley watched her hand move on the paper the way a man watches something he had spent 73 years not knowing he did not know. He drove off at 11:40. He came back the next morning with a notebook and a pencil and an old bathroom scale in the truck bed. He was the first. They kept coming across 4 weeks. 10, 12, maybe 14. Ada lost count. Nobody said sorry. Nobody ever does. They said, "What kind of book is that?" They said, "And where did you get the spring scale?" They said, "And would you show me?" And she showed them every single time. Standing squared with her weight on the back heel, freckles across her nose and cheekbones going pink in the January air. Explaining tear and gut fill and shrink like she was reading a recipe. The tan canvas jacket softened by that month into something the color of wet leaves, the plaid flannel showing at the collar. Her hands rough now from opening 90 pounds of gait in cold weather twice a day. The birthmark below her left ear catching the light from the bulb when she leaned over the table to point at something. They did not sit at Amos's chair. Nobody sat at Amos's chair. They sat at the 4 side chairs and they watched a 24-year-old woman with a low ponytail teach them the trade their fathers had taught them badly. And Preston Whitfield. Preston Whitfield got transferred. That is it. That is the whole ending. No handcuffs, no perp walk, no ruined man weeping on a courthouse step. The company moved him to a regional post in western Indiana with a title that had the word compliance in it. And he went. In the charcoal wool jacket and the polished oxblood loafers, chin lifted, one hand in the trouser pocket, silver rectangular glasses catching the light of a parking lot he would never see again. The man who had looked at her across a stainless steel clipboard and said, "Sweetheart, you are a small operator with a small operator's arithmetic. The machine does not care what your grandfather wrote in a book was not punished. He was made irrelevant, which for a man like that is worse. Nobody in Halloway County ever needed him again." His name went off the coffee counter conversation inside a month. Off the feed store bulletin board inside 2. By March, when a young reporter from the Louisville paper drove down to write a follow-up piece and stopped at the Kettle Springs feed store and asked the men at the counter what they thought of Preston Whitfield. Now Hollis Bowen looked up from his ledger with the wire-rimmed glasses on the chain, and he said, "Who?" The men at the counter laughed, not unkindly. They laughed the way old men laugh when they are burying something in the softest patch of dirt they can find. The reporter did not get the joke. Ada took her settlement. And here is where you find out what somebody actually believes. She did not buy land. She did not buy cattle. She bought a used 70-foot steel truck scale out of a closed grain terminal in Owensboro. Pit and all, hauled in 4 sections on lowboys, $31,000. Then she spent $19,000 more on the pit itself because that is where scales die. She poured it with a 2% slope to a French drain running out the low side of the ridge. Gravel sump. Weep holes at every cell pocket. Water is what eats load cells. Water is what killed the south corner of the scale that had robbed her and every other producer in the county for a decade. Her pit drains dry inside an hour of a 2-inch rain. She checks it with a flashlight every Sunday. She wrote the maintenance schedule into a new hardbound ledger in Amos's exact format. Date, weather, hour, reading, initials, section test quarterly, zero check daily, seal inspection monthly. First entry top line her own handwriting. A number you cannot check is not a number. It is a story somebody is telling you. Certified public scale. Open to any producer in the county at cost. $3 a load. Enough to cover the state inspection and nothing more. The first neighbor's trailer rolled onto her deck at 6 in the morning on a Wednesday in April. Headlights still on. Engine breathing steam into the cold. It was Wendell Dinkins. He did not say anything when he got out. He just walked to the office, which was a repurposed shipping container. Elias Kessler had helped her paint the color of dried oak leaves. He nodded once. She wrote him a ticket. He walked back to his truck. He got in. He drove off. She stood in the doorway of the shipping container with the ticket book still in her hand, and she watched his taillights go down the ridge road toward town, and the sun came up behind her, and the pink came up in her cheekbones from the cold. And she stood there a long time, not saying anything at all. By 1990, the dawn traffic on the Combs scale started before the light did. Trailers lined the county road, nose to tail running lamps, burning orange in the fog. Drivers with a coffee, steaming out of dented thermoses, waiting their turn on a certified public deck that any producer in 4 counties could roll onto for the cost of the ticket paper and the state inspection stamp. Ada was late 20s then. Same low ponytail, medium brown gone a shade lighter at the temples from 4 winters of dawn work. Same worn red and cream plaid flannel button-up under the same tan canvas farm jacket softened another 2 years. Same faded medium blue jeans, dusty at the thighs from feeding out. Same brass cattle tag punch swinging on the leather loop at her belt. She walked the line with a thermos of her own and handed tickets through truck windows. And men who had once laughed themselves stupid at the idea of a woman checking anybody's arithmetic said good morning to her and meant it. The pasture told its own version. When she took the place from Amos, the organic matter in the north sections read 1.1%, pale, tight, ashy stuff that shed rain instead of drinking it. 22 years of rotation, of trampled residue, of animals moving before they could scalp a paddock down to dirt. The lab sheets came back 2.9%, dark crumb, earthworm channels you could poke a pencil into, water disappearing into the ground instead of running to the ditch. She kept every sheet in a cardboard box under the stairs in order because she had learned young that the only thing that beats a confident man's opinion is a stack of paper he cannot argue with. The practice spread the way real things spread. Slow, then all at once. Section testing, weighing a load, then re-weighing off a random third of it, then checking the math against the pit floor. Went from Ada Combs's peculiar habit to standard operating procedure at 4 county sale barns. Then it went further than that. Buyers started writing it into contracts. Line item, plain language. Seller reserves right to independent section weight at certified public scale. Feedlot boys up in Ohio started asking for it. A packing outfit in Indiana printed it on the back of every purchase agreement, which is a hell of a legacy for a woman who had never once raised her voice at anybody. Elias Kessler lived to see the contracts. He would come out on Saturdays and stand at the rail with his hands behind his back, rocking on his heels the way he always did. Tan line across his forehead. Reading glasses pushed up into that thin white hair. Laugh lines cut so deep they stayed folded when he was not laughing. He would watch the tickets print. He would say nothing, which from Elias Kessler was a standing ovation. Hyde died in his sleep at 91 years old in February, with 3 inches of snow on the ground, in the wood stove still warm. The envelope came a week later from his daughter. Plain paper, Ada's name in ballpoint. And inside it, no note, because there did not need to be one, was the scratched steel folding rule that had lived in his chest pocket for 60 years. She put it in her jacket pocket. It stayed there. And then the last part of it. The part the old man had been aiming at the whole time without ever saying so out loud. The apprentice showed up in the spring of Ada's 62nd year. Her name was Faye Bennett, 23 years old, a diesel mechanic's daughter from a farm 2 counties over. Slim, sun-browned in the way of a young woman who had been outside all her life. Wispy strands of dark hair falling around her forehead, in temples the way strands always fell around Ada's when she was that age. A serious mouth, eyes the color of weak tea. Faye Bennett had read about the section weight clause in a farm paper up in Illinois and had wanted to know who had started it. Ada gave her a cot in the back room, a pair of coveralls, a flashlight. For the first 4 months, she taught her exactly 3 things: how to inspect a pit, how to read a beam scale, how to keep a ticket log so clean a state examiner would get bored looking at it. Ada taught the way Elias had taught, which is to say barely. She would walk the young woman down the concrete steps into the pit under the deck, into that cold mineral smell of damp stone and axle grease. And she would kneel, knees popping now, medium brown hair gone the color of ash pulled back in the same low ponytail, freckles still scattered across the bridge of her nose, the soft coffee-colored birthmark below her left ear still catching the beam. And she would shine the flashlight along the knife edges and the check rods and the levers, not saying much, just holding the light where Elias Kessler had once held it for her. On the third bearing back, where a quarter-inch of packed manure and grit will make a scale read light on every single load, and no one upstairs will ever know. There, she would say, that was the lesson. That was the whole lesson. The girl learned to run her thumb along the pivot and feel the difference between clean steel and a film of dirt. Learn that a scale does not lie on purpose. Somebody has to help it. Here is the zoom out, and it is the part that ought to keep a man up at night. The whole thing, the pasture, the contracts, the 4 counties, the state cases that came after, started with one wrong number on one ticket. 1,140 pounds where there should have been closer to 1,200. A difference of about 60 pounds on one steer, call it $40. The kind of number a tired man signs without reading because arguing costs more than the money. Multiply that by 900 head a week. Multiply that by 50 weeks. Multiply it by 11 years in a network of barns nobody had audited because auditing costs money and nobody was complaining. That is what Preston Whitfield had understood better than anyone. And it is why he was never nervous, not once, not even at the end. He did not steal from anybody. He just made sure the ground under the number stayed unexamined. He had stood on that deck in his polished oxblood loafers with his stainless steel clipboard tucked under one arm, thin silver glasses catching the light, and he had told a 24-year-old woman with a patient little smile that she should be grateful anyone bothered to buy from a place like hers at all, that people who could not do the math should not be embarrassed about it. They should just sign. Ada signed nothing. She waited herself. That is the whole pattern. Somebody profits from nobody looking underneath. Always has been. The last thing Ada did that October morning was hand Faye Bennett the flashlight in the cardboard box of Elias Kessler's journals, the water-stained ones, the pencil sketches of lever ratios, the feed notes in that cramped block print. She set the folding rule on top of the stack. The steel was worn smooth at the seams from 60 years of a thumb. She said a number is only as honest as the ground it stands on. She looked at the young. Faye's dark hair caught the wind. Ada said, "Go look underneath." Faye Bennett went. Ada stood at the deck rail alone, 62 years old. Silver at the temples, gone that soft gray of a woman who has worked outdoors for a long life. The tan canvas jacket, the same one softer now than any glove. The worn red and cream plaid flannel showing at the collar. The medium blue jeans faded almost pale at the thighs. Her hands on the rail, her breath coming out white in the October morning air. Somewhere out past the north fence, a killdeer called from the creek bottom, the way killdeers called in that country in October, in the year Amos Combs had underlined a sentence in a leather journal in pencil. She could hear the low, steady grind of the diesel forklift Faye Bennett was starting up out at the pit hatch. She could hear the click of a check rod being tapped with a folding rule. She could hear the pencil scratch of a young woman writing a number in a hardbound ledger for the first time. And she could hear in the quiet under all of it the way a man hears his own father's voice long after the funeral, a cramped, hard-pressed pencil hand from 1961, saying the thing again one more time so his granddaughter would not forget. A number is only as honest as the ground it stands on. Ada Combs put her hand flat on the rail. She left it there for a long moment. Then she pushed off of the rail. She turned toward the office trailer with its dried oak leaf paint and its single small window catching the light of a rising sun over Halloway County, Kentucky, and she walked back across the gravel apron with her weight on her back heel. Brass cattle tag punch swinging on the leather loop at her belt, 40 years of steel folding rule writing in her pocket where it lived now. Behind her, the young woman on her knees at the edge of the pit shone the flashlight beam into the dark, and she moved it slow, the way she had been taught to move it, and she stopped it on the third bearing back. She did not say anything. She did not have to. She knew in her palm and not her head in the way Ada Combs had known, and Amos Combs had known, and Elias Kessler had known, that a scale is not a machine. A scale is a promise. And a promise made over a pit that nobody has swept in 11 years is not a promise at all. It is a bet the house always wins. Unless somebody kneels down. Unless somebody looks underneath. Unless somebody weighs it twice. Faye Bennett stood up out of the pit. She had dust on her knees. She had a smudge of grease on her cheek from resting her jaw against the check rod housing. She walked over to the deck rail where Ada was watching, and she said quiet, the way a farmer says a thing she is sure of bearing three. Ada nodded once. She said, "Show me." They walked back to the pit together, the old woman and the young one, the 62-year-old and the 23-year-old, down the concrete steps, into the cold mineral smell of damp stone and axle grease. And Ada Combs in her worn red and cream plaid flannel and her softened tan canvas jacket in the same faded medium blue denim she had worn since she was 24 years old and a man in oxblood loafers had told her to sign the ticket and go home, knelt down beside the young woman in front of a bearing plate on a scale nobody in this country would ever get away with cheating. She took the flashlight. She held it steady. And she taught the same lesson that had been taught to her at a fence line at dawn in December of 1987, and that had been written in pencil in a leather journal in 1961, and that had been true in one form or another since the first bushel of grain was ever weighed on a beam scale in a barn. Not the number. The ground. Outside the sun came all the way up over the ridge. A killdeer called from the creek bottom. And somewhere in western Indiana, in an office he did not enjoy in a job that had the word compliance in it and no authority attached, an aging man in a charcoal wool jacket sat at a desk and did not know that a young woman he had never heard of was kneeling in front of a bearing plate in Halloway County, Kentucky, learning the exact trick he had once run and that had once been the whole shape of his career. He did not know. He would never know. That was the punishment. Not prison, not disgrace, not the front page, being forgotten by a woman he had told one cold morning across a stainless steel clipboard to go home. She had gone home. She had never left. And the ground she stood on, 40 acres north of the Ridge Road in Halloway County, Kentucky, was in the end honest, because she had made it honest. One number at a time, one ticket at a time, one steer at a time, weigh it twice, once for the market, once for the truth. That was the whole religion. That is still the whole religion. And Ada Combs, 62 years old, silver at the temples, kneeling in a pit beside a young woman she was teaching by lantern light, the way a man in 1987 had once taught her, put her hand flat on the concrete floor of the pit and left it there for a moment, and she said quiet to nobody, or to her grandfather, or to whatever it is that listens when a life's work has at long last come around there. The scale read true, the ground was honest, the killdeer called, and the pencil kept moving in a hardbound ledger on a kitchen table under a bulb that had not gone out in 40 years because in that country, in Halloway County, Kentucky, the light stays on as long as somebody is willing to keep looking. Somebody was. Somebody always is. Somebody always will be. A number is only as honest as the ground it stands on. Go look underneath.